Everyone knows about slavery. The cotton fields, the auction blocks, the whips, the chains. We know about families torn apart, people worked to death, an entire race held captive for 2.5 centuries. But did you know that by the 1830s, portions of Virginia and Maryland had stopped growing tobacco altogether and switched to a different cash crop? That crop? Black children. After Congress banned the international slave trade in 1808, American enslavers faced a supply problem. No more ships from Africa. But the cotton boom in the Deep South was just beginning, and it demanded bodies, hundreds of thousands of them. The solution didn't come from overseas. It came from inside the system itself. They turned the Upper South into breeding grounds, actual farms where the primary product wasn't cotton or tobacco or sugar. It was enslaved people, born on site, raised to adolescence, then sold downriver to Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia. This wasn't happening in secret. Plantation owners discussed it in agricultural journals. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to his farm manager in 1819, calculating the profit margin on enslaved women's children. He called the women breeders. He noted that their increase, his word for their children, represented a reliable 4% annual profit. By the 1850s, Virginia was exporting 6,000 enslaved people per year to the Deep South. Most of them were under 15 years old. Most of them were born specifically to be sold. The numbers tell the story. In 1808, there were roughly 1 million enslaved people in America. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million. That growth didn't happen naturally. It happened because human beings were industrially bred like animals, their reproductive capacity extracted as ruthlessly as their labor. Their children turned into widgets in a supply chain that fed the wealthiest economy on Earth. The breeding farms had their own economics, their own medical protocols, their own systems of enforcement. Enslaved women were assessed for fertility the way livestock breeders assess stock. Men were selected and forced into pairings. The children born from this system were temporary. Mothers knew from the moment of birth that the child would be sold, usually between ages 8 and 12. Every bond formed was designed to be severed. This isn't fringe history. This isn't speculation. The account books survive. The bills of sale survive. The court records where women's fertility was litigated as property value survive. What happened on the breeding farms sits in a category of horror that textbooks don't touch. Not because the evidence isn't there, because the truth is worse than what most people are ready to believe about slavery. But it happened, and the people who did it kept meticulous records. The breeding farms concentrated in the Chesapeake region, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, places where tobacco had depleted the soil and traditional agriculture no longer generated the profits it once did. Enslaved people became the replacement crop. The math was simple. A healthy enslaved woman who could produce a child every 2 years represented compounding value. Each child, by the 1850s, could be sold to Deep South plantations for $800 to $1,500. One woman, over a reproductive lifetime of 15 to 20 years, could generate wealth equivalent to $150,000 in modern currency. Enslavers discussed this openly, in letters, in plantation journals, in account books that listed women by name alongside their increase. The language was clinical, cold. These were business records, not confessions. A plantation ledger from Virginia in 1842 lists a woman named Betsy with the notation, "Fourth increase, male, healthy, projected value $900. Another entry from the same ledger, dated 3 years later, reads, "Betsy, 6th increase, female, small but vigorous, retain for breeding or sell at 10 years depending on development." The system required planning. Owners identified which women had the highest fertility based on family history and prior births. They tracked menstrual cycles. They consulted doctors when conception didn't happen on schedule. They adjusted diets, modified work assignments, moved women into different quarters, all to maximize the chances of pregnancy. One agricultural journal from 1836, published in Richmond, included an article titled, "On the Management of Negroes." The author recommended that enslaved women be given lighter field work during pregnancy and better rations after birth, not out of compassion, but to protect the investment. The article compared the care of pregnant enslaved women to the care of pregnant livestock and used nearly identical language for both. Thomas Jefferson wasn't an outlier. He was typical. His 1819 letter to his farm manager stated, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm. What she produces is an addition to the capital, while his labors disappear in mere consumption." The people who ran these operations saw themselves as rational businessmen. They kept careful records because the breeding farms were profitable, predictable, and legal. The system worked because it was designed to work, and it required 2 things. First, identifying girls early. Second, eliminating every dimension of their humanity except reproductive capacity. That process started young. Girls as young as 13, sometimes younger, were assessed for breeding suitability. The examinations were explicit. Hips measured, teeth checked, family history reviewed for fertility, live births, complications during labor. This wasn't subtle. It happened in front of other enslaved people. The girls knew what was happening. Their mothers knew. Everyone on the plantation knew. Once designated, their lives changed. Work assignments shifted to lighter field labor, not as kindness, but as preservation of reproductive health. Rations improved slightly. They were sometimes moved into different sleeping quarters, separated from family to prevent emotional attachments that might complicate future pairings. A girl named Sarah appears in court records from an 1843 estate dispute in Virginia. She was designated as a breeder at 14. The plantation ledger tracked her menstrual cycles. When she didn't conceive within 6 months of her first pairing, the owner consulted a physician and changed her diet to include more meat and milk. She gave birth to her first child at 16. The ledger entry notes the birth weight, 8 pounds, and the projected sale value, $700 at age 10 if healthy and obedient. Sarah is mentioned again in the same court records 11 years later. By then, she had given birth to 6 children. 5 survived infancy. All 5 had been sold by the time she was 25. The court case that preserved her story wasn't about her freedom or her suffering. It was about whether she should be classified as an asset or collateral in a debt dispute. The judge ruled she was an asset. She remained enslaved. Designation was irreversible. Once marked for breeding, everything else in these girls' lives became secondary. Their value was measured in future births. Their bodies were monitored. Their futures were determined before they were old enough to understand what had been taken from them. The selection process wasn't random. Owners looked for specific traits. Height, because taller women were believed to have easier births. Broad hips for the same reason. A family history of multiple live births with few complications. They wanted women who could produce children reliably, repeatedly, and survive the process long enough to make the investment worthwhile. One overseer's diary from a Maryland plantation in 1837 includes an entry about a girl named Patience, age 13, who was being evaluated. The entry reads, "Good hips, strong teeth. Mother bore 9 with no losses. Will be ready for breeding next year. Expect high yield." Patience was a child. The man writing those words was deciding her future based on her body's potential to produce other bodies that would be sold for profit. She had no say, no choice, no escape. The system had identified them. Now it needed to put them to use. The breeding farms operated through 2 primary methods. The first was forced pairings. Owners selected enslaved men based on size, strength, or perceived genetic traits, and ordered them into relationships with designated women. Refusal wasn't an option. Some enslavers used incentives: a private cabin instead of barracks, slightly better food, a promise that the children might stay on the same plantation, though this promise was rarely kept. But incentives were still coercion. The appearance of choice didn't make it consent. Others used violence. Men who refused were whipped, sold south to harsher plantations, or forced to watch their actual partners receive punishment. Women who resisted faced the same. The system had total control over their lives, and it used that control without hesitation. The second method involved traveling breeders, sometimes called stockmen. These were enslaved men moved from plantation to plantation on schedules designed to align with women's fertility cycles. They stayed long enough to ensure conception, then were moved to the next location. They were valued not for labor, but for genetics. A man named Simon appears in Maryland court records from 1854. He testified in a freedom suit that between 1848 and 1854, he was forced to father children with women on 4 different plantations. He was never allowed to stay long enough to know the children. He didn't know their names. He didn't know if they were boys or girls. He didn't know if they were still alive. Simon's testimony describes being purchased by a slave trader specifically for breeding purposes. The trader's correspondence, preserved in the court records, refers to Simon as a proven breeder with good size and no known health defects. The trader sold Simon's services to plantation owners for a fee, moving him between locations like rented equipment. Simon was destroyed by this system just as completely as the women. He had a wife and 2 children on the plantation where he was originally enslaved. When he was sold to the trader, his family was sold separately. He never saw them again. His humanity was reduced to a biological function. His own family was torn apart so he could be forced to create children for someone else's profit. These men had no power to refuse. Compliance meant survival. Refusal meant death or sail to the deep south, where survival rates were even lower. Some men internalized the guilt of what they were being forced to do. Others dissociated, treating it as another form of labor they had no choice but to perform. A few resisted and paid for it with their lives. Every child born from these forced pairings entered the world already marked for sale. The bonds that formed despite everything, and bonds did form because humanity persists even in conditions designed to destroy it, were built on a foundation of guaranteed loss. Mothers knew their children were temporary. Fathers, when they were allowed to know their children at all, knew the same. The system was designed to break every connection it created. A woman named Louisa appears in Virginia court records from 1856. The records were part of an estate dispute, not a freedom suit. Louisa was property being litigated over. Between the ages of 15 and 32, Louisa gave birth to 11 children. 9 survived infancy. All 9 were sold. She never saw any of them past age 10. The court case began when her owner died. His widow claimed Louisa as part of the estate. A creditor claimed her as collateral for an unpaid debt. The dispute centered on a single question. Was Louisa still fertile and therefore valuable, or were her breeding years finished? Both parties hired medical witnesses. Louisa was examined. Physicians inspected her physically and reviewed her reproductive history to assess whether she could still conceive. The trial transcript describes this examination in clinical detail. They discussed her uterus, her menstrual cycles, the difficulty of her last birth. They debated whether the complications from that birth had rendered her permanently infertile. The language in the transcript is detached, precise. The physicians were appraising livestock genetics. Louisa was in the room while they discussed her body as if it were machinery that might or might not still function. The court ruled that her breeding years were most likely over. Her value was assessed at $400, down from $1,200 when she was 25. The judge awarded her to the creditor. She remained enslaved. When Louisa became unable to produce children, her worth as a human being, at least in the eyes of the system, dropped by 2/3. She was sold to a farm in Kentucky and classified as a field hand. The court records don't mention her again. The 9 children Louisa bore were sold at different times to different buyers. Most were sold between ages 8 and 12. This was the standard practice. Children that age were old enough to survive the journey south and young enough to be trained for decades of labor. The routes were brutal. Slave traders moved people in coffles, groups of 30 to 50, chained together at the neck and ankles, walking sometimes 700 miles over 2 months. Children, too young to walk the full distance, were carried by older children or adults, adding to the physical toll. Traders' correspondence from the 1840s and 1850s refers to wastage, their term for people who died during transport. It was factored into pricing as an expected loss. When the coffles reached deep south markets, families who had managed to stay together during the journey were separated at auction. New Orleans auction records from the 1850s show mothers and children sold to different buyers routinely. The auctioneers barely remarked on it. Separation was standard procedure. Franklin and Armfield, the largest slave trading firm in American history, operated out of Alexandria, Virginia. Their account books show bulk purchases of children from Virginia and Maryland farms and individual sales in New Orleans, Natchez, and Charleston. A child purchased for $400 in Virginia could sell for $900 in Louisiana. The firm moved thousands of people per year. Most were children. Most were born on breeding farms. The separation economy was efficient, profitable, and legal. It treated human bonds as obstacles to profit and eliminated them accordingly. Louisa gave birth to 11 children and lost every one of them. The system didn't care. It had gotten what it wanted. Some plantation owners promised freedom to enslaved women after they produced a certain number of children. 10 children, 15 children. The number varied, but the structure was the same. Produce enough, and you go free. The promises were almost never kept. A woman named Harriet was enslaved on a Virginia plantation. The owner's account books, preserved in a county historical archive, document her life in careful detail. Between 1831 and 1850, Harriet gave birth to 13 children. 12 survived infancy. Her owner promised her freedom after she produced 12 living children. The promise was written in his personal journal in 1835, when Harriet was 19 and pregnant with her third child. The entry reads, "Told Harriet she will have her freedom after 12. This should ensure her cooperation and maintain her health through continued breeding." Harriet reached 12 children in 1848. She was 32 years old. When she asked for her freedom, her owner added a new condition. The children had to survive to age 10. 4 of her children were still under 10 at the time. By 1852, all 12 children had reached age 10. Her owner added another condition. The children had to sell for satisfactory prices. If their sale value was below projected estimates, it would indicate poor health or temperament, which he claimed reflected Harriet's failure to raise them properly. Harriet died in 1853 at age 41. She died enslaved. The final entry about her in the plantation ledger notes her death and lists the total value her children generated at sale, $11,200. There's no mention of the freedom she was promised. No explanation for why it was never granted. The owner simply moved the goalpost every time she reached it, and then she died. The cruelty wasn't incidental, it was strategic. The promise of freedom kept Harriet compliant for 18 years. It kept her healthy. It kept her producing children. The owner never intended to honor it. The promise was a tool, and it worked exactly as designed. Other plantations used a different structure. Behave, accept the pairings, produce children on schedule, and your children stay local. You might see them occasionally. You might be allowed to visit them on holidays. Resist, and they're sold to Mississippi or Louisiana. Mississippi and Louisiana functioned as threats by name alone. Enslaved people knew the conditions there. Sugar plantations worked people to death in 7 years on average. Cotton plantations weren't much better. Being sold south was a death sentence, just a slower one than the whip. This forced mothers into impossible choices: participate in your own exploitation or guarantee your children suffer worse. Either way, you lose. But one option felt slightly less unbearable than the other, so mothers complied. A woman named Celia testified in a freedom suit in Missouri in 1855. She described being told by her owner that if she didn't accept a new pairing after her previous partner was sold, her infant son would be sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. She accepted the pairing. The child was sold anyway when he turned 9. Her owner had lied, but the threat had already accomplished what it was designed to do. She had complied. The medical consequences of this system barely appear in records, but the fragments that survive are devastating. Forced pregnancies at intervals that didn't allow bodies to recover. Labor without medical care. Infections left untreated because pregnancy was valued and the mother's health was not. A plantation ledger from Kentucky, dated 1847, includes an entry about a woman who died during childbirth. The entry notes her death in a single sentence, then continues with an assessment of the infant's projected sale value. The baby lived 3 weeks. The system demanded everything and gave nothing. It extracted reproduction through coercion, manipulation, and violence. It broke every promise it made, and it kept running because it was legal, profitable, and protected by every institution that mattered. Enslaved women didn't accept the breeding system passively. They resisted in every way available to them, and they paid for it. Some women used herbal abortifacients, plant-based remedies passed down through generations. Cottonroot, pennyroyal, tansy. These substances could induce miscarriage if taken in the right doses at the right time. They were dangerous. Too much could cause hemorrhaging or death. But women used them anyway because pregnancy meant more children born into slavery, more children who would be sold, more grief that was guaranteed. Other women practiced prolonged breastfeeding to delay ovulation. Breastfeeding can suppress fertility temporarily, though it's not reliable. Women nursed their children longer than necessary in hopes of extending the time before the next forced pregnancy. Plantation owners caught on. Some began separating mothers from infants earlier to restart the breeding cycle faster. self-induced miscarriages happened. Women threw themselves downstairs, lifted loads too heavy for pregnant bodies, induced trauma deliberately. When these acts were discovered, the punishments were designed to eliminate any possibility of future resistance. An overseer's diary from a Virginia plantation in 1839 describes punishing a woman suspected of ending her own pregnancy. She was moved into a cabin with a window facing the overseer's quarters. He watched her every night to verify she stayed inside. During the day, her movements were restricted. She was assigned work close to the main house where she could be monitored constantly. The diary notes that she conceived again 4 months later, and the overseer took credit for preventing further sabotage. Other women were locked in quarters at night, their doors barred from the outside. Some were forced to sleep in rooms with other women who were instructed to report any suspicious behavior. The surveillance was constant and dehumanizing, but it didn't stop every attempt at resistance. Pregnancy didn't stop escape attempts. Runaway advertisements from the 1840s and 1850s described dozens of pregnant women who fled. The Virginia Gazette in 1848 advertised a reward for a woman named Rachel, described as approximately 7 months pregnant, who escaped from a plantation in Henrico County. Another ad from 1851 described a woman named Dinah, near her time of delivery, who ran from a plantation in Charles City County. The risks were extraordinary: being pursued while pregnant, giving birth alone in woods or swamps with no medical help, traveling with a newborn infant while trying to avoid capture. Most of these women were caught. The punishments were severe, but they ran anyway. A few made it. They disappeared into free black communities in northern states, or into the historical record entirely, their stories surviving only as names in runaway ads that were never followed by recapture notices. Men resisted too. Some refused the forced pairings and accepted the beatings that followed. Court records from Kentucky in 1843 mention a man named Isaac who refused to be paired with a woman designated for breeding. The overseer tried to force him into her cabin. Isaac fought back. He struck the overseer and broke his nose. Isaac was sold to a plantation in Louisiana within a week. He died there 2 years later. The cause of death isn't recorded. His resistance bought nothing except the resistance itself. The woman he refused to be paired with was paired with someone else. The system continued. These acts of defiance didn't break the system. The system was too large, too profitable, too legally protected. Individual resistance mattered to the people who chose it, but it didn't stop the breeding farms. They kept operating until federal law ended them in 1865. By then, they'd been running for over 50 years. Between 1808 and 1865, an estimated 1 million enslaved people were sold from the Upper South to the Deep South through the domestic slave trade. The majority were children and young adults born on breeding farms. 1 million lives that began as commodities, born into a system that valued them only as future inventory. Their mothers' names are mostly lost. Their fathers' names are almost never recorded. They were severed from their origins by design. These children were sold to cotton plantations in Mississippi and Alabama, sugar plantations in Louisiana, rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. The conditions they faced were brutal. The life expectancy of an enslaved person on a Louisiana sugar plantation was 7 years after arrival. Cotton plantations weren't much better. The labor was endless, the punishments were severe, and death was common. The children born on Virginia and Maryland breeding farms fed that machine. They replaced the bodies that were worked to death. The system required constant replenishment, and the breeding farms provided it. The wealth generated by this trade was staggering. The domestic slave trade was the second largest economy in the United States before the Civil War, surpassed only by cotton production itself. And cotton's profitability depended on the labor of enslaved people, many of whom were products of the breeding system. Franklin and Armfield, the slave trading firm based in Alexandria, Virginia, moved more than 10,000 people between 1828 and 1836 alone. Their profits during that period were equivalent to $200 million in modern currency. Most of that money came from the sale of children born on breeding farms. The men who ran Franklin and Armfield retired wealthy. Isaac Franklin bought a plantation in Louisiana and became one of the richest men in the state. John Armfield bought land in Tennessee and lived comfortably until his death in 1871. Neither faced legal consequences for their role in the trade. Neither was prosecuted. They died free, respected in their communities, their fortunes intact. The same is true for the plantation owners who operated breeding farms. They kept detailed records of their operations because there was no reason to hide what they were doing. It was legal, it was profitable, it was accepted. When slavery ended in 1865, none of these men faced trials. No reparations were paid to the women who had been used as breeders or to the children who had been sold. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but it didn't provide restitution. It didn't return stolen children to their mothers. It didn't compensate women for decades of forced reproduction. The families who built their wealth on breeding farms kept that wealth. They passed it down through generations. Many of their descendants still hold it today, though the source has been sanitized from family histories. The enslaved people got nothing. No compensation, no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done to them. They were freed into a country that had no plan for their survival and no intention of repairing the damage slavery had caused. The breeding farms ended in 1865, but their children didn't disappear. They became the ancestors of millions of Black Americans alive today. The severed family trees, the generational trauma, the wealth gap that began with bodies sold as commodities and compounded over a century and a half. All of it traces back to the same source. The country built on their forced reproduction has never fully accounted for what was done.